Alright, welcome back to Don't Think Just Charge. I'm Dave, he's Harvey, and today we're starting off our new series for you, which is Mastering the Game, starting with Objectives. First of all, it would be good for us to have a look at what the rules for objectives actually are. From the beginner's rules, it says that after the table's been prepared, you and your opponent set up D3 plus 2 objective markers on the battlefield. You roll off, and the winner places the first objective, and then you alternate back and forth, placing one marker each outside of the deployment zones and over 9 inches away from other markers. You also can't place objective markers in unreachable positions like on impassable terrain or on spots that are too tight to get to. Then, in terms of where you're playing for the objectives in the mission, in the actual game itself, if you've got a unit within 3 inches of an objective at the end of a round, it is seized and controlled by you. The objective remains controlled even if you move your units away from it, but it becomes neutral if it is contested by multiple units, or at least one unit that is, from either player. At the end of all of the 4 rounds of the game, whoever controls the most objectives wins. Nice and easy. Now, this gives an illusion of a really basic structure for your game, but the actual placement and the way that you interact with your objectives throughout the course of the game is far more complicated than you might think. Even that very first step of deploying the objectives and passing it back and forth with your opponent is a mini game of OPR before you start to play OPR. Why is that the case? Now, not only are you already having a bit of a chess-like interaction and you are trying to probe what your opponent wants to do whilst also setting out what you want to do, but it's going to be the first point at which your analysis skills kick in. First of all, how well do you know your own army and how well are you analysing your opponent's? Now, the first thing in that whole part is knowing what your own army is, and with that, there are multiple strategies that you can consider.
So I think the first thing to consider is, are you placing along the middle line or not? The middle line placement is probably the safest bet for objective placements. You're going to be the same distance from the objectives as your opponent is.
Yeah.
And this is pretty good if you don't think you've got a strong enough read on where the advantage lies, or perhaps both of you are just playing really honest armies, or you're both playing equally as degenerate full ambush armies. It's okay to just be like, I don't see any clear advantage either side here. Let's just put them down the middle.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing I would consider. If you're unsure, it's always better to put an objective in the middle of the board, put an objective on the flanks, and just kind of like, make a quick judgment call about whether you want this to be grouped up or not, and then kind of play along that middle line.
Yeah.
The alternative to playing along the middle line, there's like 2 steps to this. The first step is home objectives. So if you have objective place in priority, or you have enough objectives to place, you can choose to place one objective on your side, one objective on their side, nestled right up next to the deployment zones. Now this is really good if you have an army that can threaten a home objective.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Don't think I want to put home objectives because I'm playing dwarves. Unless you're bringing, a stack of ambushing miners or something, don't go putting something on the other side of the board that you can't reach. On the flip side, if you're playing against someone who has low ability, or you think you can prevent them from advancing up the board, then a home objective is great. Scout is really strong because you can place your units halfway up the board and immediately be controlling the center of the board, which means that they're never really going to make it to your backboard because you've kind of started 12 inches closer.
There's an important point here as well, is that we've seen it before where people take that risk of all on the home line, where you've got to a table, put your minis down, rolled off for your objectives, and then you've got 3 and they've got 2, and you've just gone, well, I'll do 1, 2, 3. It's an important thing to remember that you have a further roll off to decide what board side you're on, and if you want to take that 50-50-ish roll of going, there's a chance that my opponent instead gets that objective deployment that I want, it's a risk. It's a risk to know about, and it's something to be able to handle. And at the same time, the risk-averse opposite of that, I suppose, is kind of what you're hinting at here, but just to say it really clearly, is that sometimes you might want to just put it on the other side, and your opponent might be a bit confused if it's a 2-2, or if it's only on 3 and you have 2 objectives, and you put one on your home line and one on your opponent's home line as they perceive it, then that might be a bit confusing for them. But if you've done that pre-analysis to go, I have one slow unit. I have unit of artillery if I'm playing Human Defense Force, say. I've got a mortar gun that I want my first move to be just moving on to this point and then never again. And then my shock troopers are going to come in from the skies, from ambush, and go straight for that back objective. Brilliant. You've taken the time to analyse where you're doing, what you're doing, and how you're going to then play the game, which you're thinking 3 moves ahead, and that's always a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, you also touched on it there, but the next step after home objectives is complete asymmetrical placement, right? So if you're playing in a 5 objective game or a 3 objective game, you can place 2 or 3 objectives if you've got priority, just in a line on one side of the board. You can even do it if the opponent is playing home objectives as well. So if you're playing in a 4-on-4 and they place their first one as a home objective, you can place your other 2 on their side of the board and just go like, yeah, I back my ability to take home objectives in a way that I think you can't.
Yeah.
So ambush and scout love this play once again. If you win the roll off, you've got 3 objectives on your side of the board. That's ideal, right? That's already a winning position. And if you lose the roll up, you're basically saying like, well, I'm an ambush army or I'm a scout army, and actually them starting on your side of the board isn't much of a big deal for me. Now, obviously, this is a bit of a gambit, but it doesn't mean that there isn't strategy involved in it. It isn't just straight up, do I win the coin toss?
Yeah.
But yeah, each one of those is kind of like a varying levels of confidence, really, in your read on the opponent's army and your read on your own army, really.
Also, it's something important, I think, to be able to say that you can play a varied strategy with your one army. If you are bringing perhaps a 50-50 split of ambush and non-ambush, that you've got a game plan. And there's something that we've not really discussed yet that's important at this point, which is territory. Take a pretty typical situation. If your opponent brings a shooting heavy army and you're melee heavy, you can put your opponent, as the melee player, you can put your opponent into a box quite easily by aggressively moving up the board, positioning yourself for a whole host of round 2 charges, and at the same time you're taking multiple objectives, because then once you're charging off of the objectives, your opponent might be running around too much trying to keep their shooting line alive, and they don't have the time in 4 rounds to get back onto the objectives once they've cleaned up or handled the huge pressure that you're putting on them. So territory as well is such an important thing to consider, which, taking it back to the first kind of general deployment style you thought about, all on the middle line, that might be something that you think is going to be better for you as perhaps an all melee army. But at the same time, you look at the terrain and you look about where the good firing lines are. You want to make them, maybe you want to put them down a very simple symmetrical line down a firing corridor because it's something that you can handle. That terrain game, that actual area you're controlling on the board, is something that will matter when it comes down to that round 3 and that round 4 and the subsequent moves away from combat, away from firing lines, or perhaps into them firing lines and combat respectively later on.
I think the next thing to discuss, so we've discussed kind of like forwards backwards placement, right? So home objectives, middle line, asymmetrical. The next thing to mention is kind of width, so spread. So obviously, if you're playing an asymmetrical game, you could put 3 objectives in a corner on one side of the board, and the opponent puts their 2 wherever they want them. But you could also put them as widespread as you want, 1 in the middle, 2 in the corners on their side of the board. And this is more where activations comes into it. Obviously, mobility still matters, like referred to point 1 again. But this is now, okay, how much do I want to send to different places? The further apart the objectives are, the more strain there is for your army, the more places your army needs to be in. And if you have an easy way of being in a certain place through cheap units or through ambush, maybe an ambushing cheap unit even, then you will want to see your objectives further apart, especially if you've got the read on your opponent. You think like, okay, these guys are going for a real brawl. If they're going to try and make a triangle in the middle of the board, I'm going to put 2 in the other corners of the board, and I'm going to take those guaranteed because they need to be moving their Titan Lords or something into the middle of the board, right?
Yeah.
So that's the next thing to consider, definitely. Once you've decided whether you're all kind of like where you're placing them between you and your opponent, then you need to decide how far apart the objectives need to be.
I think this is a really good time, actually, whilst we're talking about perhaps lower activation armies, to discuss one of our favourite topics, which is the triangle. How would you describe the triangle?
So as mentioned before, when you're placing objectives, they need to be at least 9 inches apart. Now what that means is if you're playing with 3 objectives and you're going first, you can force the situation where you have 3 objectives exactly 9 inches apart in a triangle, which is what we describe as the triangle. Now this is really effective if you have really high quality units and you want to bring the fighting down to a very small triangle. So if you ever have this kind of priority and you feel like you have a very kind of brawly, all close together melee list, then you might want to be looking at making these triangles.
At the same time, if you've got low activations, then you really do want the triangle, because say it's in a 4 or a 5 objective game, your opponent might identify this too late and then suddenly fling one over to the corner of the board where you think perhaps you have to let that one go and focus your energy on the triangle. And also, one of the nice things about the triangle is if you do lose the roll-off, it is something that on a 4 or a 5 objective board you can force, which is a massive, massive benefit. On a 3 objective board, your triangle's more of a line if your opponent's trying to go wide, but it is really useful to have. And another thing about the triangle, as you and I discovered quite late into our playtesting for last year's UK Games Expo event, the conga line comes about there. Which,
yes,
as well, we touched on it a little bit in that bad rep, bat rep, but the conga line is where you spread out the models in your unit as far apart from one another as you can, that 1 inch, and the result of that is that units can contest 2 objectives at once, and if it's a 20 block, it can contest all 3 objectives in the triangle at the same time, which can be really deceptively powerful when your opponent thinks, oh brilliant, I've got 2 objectives here, you've got 1 unit, so you can only take 1, and you then are suddenly neutralizing one of theirs and taking one of your own. It can really flip evaluation in those final few rounds on their head.
Yeah, one of the things to consider about the 9 inches apart rule is that that's just from the marker to the marker, and all objectives are surrounded by a 3-inch zone, which means that the actual distance between objectives is only 3 inches. And now if you imagine a tiny little 3-inch triangle, it's very, very easy to contest all 3 of those objectives in that very small 3-inch triangle in the middle.
Yeah.
So definitely something to consider.
It's such that 3 inches no man's land, dead zone between the objective reach zone is really not very much at all. You can just get 2 40mm bases in that space quite handily. And so it can really catch people out, especially if you're thinking in this way. And obviously, we're describing this. We're starting to call this series Mastering the Game. If you're thinking in this way of trying to master your strategy and your opponent isn't quite on the same level of just the objective gameplay as you, you can absolutely sneak some wins and some ties if perhaps you're playing from behind and then, bam, you manage to bring a unit onto 2 objectives at once because you've set up the triangle and your opponent wasn't ready for it. Well, that's going to eke you out some cheeky little victories there, which is what we really live for. And you're kind of starting to touch on it a little bit here, but this is now coming down to your army unit choices. You've talked about, you've said it, but you haven't said it, which is cheap units with ambush. Perhaps what about a sub 100 point unit where every model has quality 6, defense 6, and 3 toughness? And something like that.
Yeah, maybe if they had Fearless or Undead as well.
Maybe if they had Fearless or Undead or No Retreat or some other morale mitigation, that might be a pretty good unit. We are talking about swarms really quite obtusely here. Swarms can be an excellent way of setting up an objective game plan, because at the same time, if you've got a morale mitigating swarm and your opponent perhaps hasn't brought very many activations, you can stick an objective on the flank. Better yet, if you've got 2 swarms, stick them on opposite flanks. And then your opponent, if they haven't got cheap units to match it, they've got to invest more points to balance with your cheap swarm unit. And this is one of the reasons that swarms are so good in the main game of OPR, because you can just suddenly gain massive point value for very little investment. It's a really excellent point to consider. And this kind of moves on a little bit. When we're talking about the wide game, we're talking about high activations, low activations. This moves on to point evaluation. Because if your opponent, if it's 2k points, your opponent's brought 5 or 6 activations, this is where I'm going to have to do very bad quick math. Say it's 5 activations. The average point cost of a unit in that army is 400 points. If you have 10 activations, I haven't misdone my maths. The maths is correct. Yeah, the maths is right there. If you've got 10 activations, your average point cost is 200 points. I'm pretty sure I'm still...
Nailed it.
Yeah.
He's nailed it. Yeah. Okay. Excellent job.
There we go. That maths GCSE is coming in strong now. If you've got 5 objectives and they're flung out wide, you can gain so much value by luring a 400 point model away to deal with your 100 or 200 point units. And yeah, If you get into a fight, they're going to kill that unit pretty fairly. But if you can then play the movement game very strategically and then just make it all about that round 4, you are in a winning position.
Yeah, I think you've kind of touched on two things there. One is that when we talk about list building, we always talk about having 7 units. The reason is because some games have 5 objectives, basically.
Yeah.
You want to be able to contest at least half the points, really, by the end of the game. And if you're bringing only 6 units, and your opponent wipes out half your guys, then 3 units is pretty
shaky.
rough.
Yeah.
And that's assuming they're all in position to go contesting, and yeah, it's not ideal. But once you kind of hit the kind of like 7, 8-ish mark, then you've got a couple of throwaway ones, and it's slightly better.
Yeah.
And the other thing you've touched on there as well is obviously KG objective play. So
your
ambush
favorite, your
units.
absolute favorite.
I mean, yeah, it's the way I play the game. At the end of the day, it's an objective game. It's not a killing game. But the ambushing swarm, let's call it, if you have that in reserve and you're going to bring it in turn 3, your opponent has to stay near their objectives.
Yeah.
So you can basically play the first 2-3 rounds of the game with them having something stuck on objective far away.
Yeah.
Now, if they are a ranged unit, let's say let's use the Dwarven Mortars, they're probably pretty happy to do that, right? But if your opponent's all melee, which is the other thing we talked about, range versus melee split, they really, really don't want to be throwing an expensive melee unit onto an objective that then has to stay there, because inevitably your swarm's going to come down in an annoying position and move its way onto the objective around 4.
Yeah.
But yes.
Yeah, it's a huge amount of a sub game, and it's the fact that we're discussing this now, and obviously we're discussing this at huge length, but this is all something for you to evaluate as a player before any single unit is moved. I was going to say before any dice is rolled, but you do have to roll to find out how many objectives and who goes first. There's been a couple of dice rolled. No shots have been fired, no units have been moved, no attacks have been made, and suddenly you're in this mini game with your opponent. And yeah, if you're playing it in a far more casual setting, click off this video, go watch a battle report instead, because this isn't going to make your experience with a player on a Sunday and just having a fun game that much better. In fact, it might be excellent for you, because you might look at it and just go, let's agree on what we're doing for objectives. We want to monster mash, right? So let's triangle it in the middle. Let's not do silly shenanigans. Let's do what we turned up to do. Or, we brought 3,000 points. We want a bit more of a tactical game here, but perhaps we're going to agree fixed objectives all down the middle line. This might help you realise that you don't want to have this objective game. If we've had this wonderful big chat about the intricacies of objectives and you go, I don't like that anymore, fine, good, I'm glad we've helped. Go for all down the middle line, go for pre-placed objectives. But it really is such an intricate part of the game, and it can be so decisive, because the dice can go in. If you're playing vampires, you're an all undead army, your last model in every single unit is worth every single point on their board, on your opponent's side if they're not undead. So your objective game has to be so tight. I mean, has to be. You could just be there to roll dice, but if you want to win 4 out of 5 games in your day, then yeah, nail your objective placements and you are suddenly in a really good spot. One of the things you kind of touched on there, which I think is always hilarious when it comes up in the games I've played it in, when you've got, say, 5 objectives and you do the triangle on your left flank and you've got 2 objectives off in the F end of nowhere, those games are always so crazy for me. I'm always reminded of one we did. I think it was with one of our mates a year or so ago. They brought Dow Union and I brought some form of Battle Brothers. I made such a mistake because we had that exact situation. 3 objectives on one flank, 2 on the other, and I said, I'm going to win this flank. I sent nobody to those objectives. He sent 1 unit. If I'd have reevaluated and sent just 1 unit over there, I'd have probably won the game. But it was actually just those objectives that lost it, because these 3 over here became tied up. Or maybe it was 1-1-0 or something like that.
Yeah.
It's an important thing to think about if you are going to do that widespread strategy. Don't disregard objectives. Don't think you've won anything. It's a really important point in this as well. Always try and play a little bit and find out your ways of going for those far objectives, playing KG if you need to, realizing how your army is going to interact with theirs. And it's something we'll come on to, I think, in another video when we're looking at your deployment and, again, your analysis of your army and what's going to be good into your opponent's units. If you're flinging something over there that you know your opponent can take out quite easily, that's when you need to learn your cagey play, I think. That's when you need to learn, I'm going to hide, I'm going to try and use the terrain to my advantage, and then I'm going to try and pressure them at the end. I'm going to conga line, try and split over 2, or perhaps I'm going to accept a 1-1 trade. So, to round out the video, we want to give you a 3-step process for you to take when you're analysing your armies going into placing objectives. And remember, this applies both to your army and your opponent's army.
Yeah, so step 1 is count activations. Look at quality of overall army. If you think that you have a wider, more activation-heavy army than your opponent, you've made that analysis, then you're looking at distance between objectives. So, first of all, make a very quick judgment call. Do I have more units than them? If I do, I probably want to be placing things further apart.
Yeah. Step 2 is going to be looking at the mobility of the respective armies. If you think that you can play a much better forward-backward game, then perhaps you want to consider having home objectives. At the same time, if you think that perhaps you are going to outweigh your opponent's strengths of their army by just having everything down the middle line, then make sure you put them in good accessible positions where you're not going to get penalised for whichever side of the board you're on.
And the third tip is to look for terrain interaction in the list. I'm talking about your striders and your flying and how they interact with your difficult and dangerous terrain. If the list has lots of strider and flying in it, then consider placing those objectives inside those terrain pieces. And if it doesn't, then try and place those objectives on the edge of those terrain pieces to try and block them off.
And there we have it, our 3-step plan for analysing lists and deciding on your objective placing strategy for one-page rules. We hope you've enjoyed this video. It's us kicking off a bit of an abstract mastering series, following how well you guys all seem to like the robots video we did previously. Our next video, for those of you particularly interested, is going to be looking at deployment, how you approach getting yourselves on the long edge of the board and putting everything on the line before blasting your and your opponent's lives to absolute hell, because it's really that simple. If you don't believe that at all, come and see our next video. But for now, please do get down in the comments, let us know your thoughts, please give us the like, the subscribes, and of course get the notifications for when we're releasing new videos so you are the first ones on the scene, so you can go down and crush your opponents at your Wargaming club. Bye!
If the army in front of you is strong, just scoot your minis up, go to the